live with Hugh and Sophia to learn a trade with the promise of freedom on his 25th birthday with good behavior. In Baltimore, Frederick was sent to the shipyards where he trained as an apprentice caulker. Here, he began to socialize with Baltimore's free black community, and it was also during this time that he first met Anna Murray, a free black woman about 5 years older than him who worked as a servant at the postmaster's house. The two fell in love and agreed to marry. In May 1838, Frederick managed to come to an agreement with Hugh Auld, allowing him to take his own lodgings and keep any wages above $3 per week. This new arrangement lasted until August 1838. At that juncture, Hugh Auld accused Frederick of attempting to escape. Fearing that he might be sold and split up from Anna, Frederick decided that he would actually try to elope. On the 3rd of September 1838, dressed as a sailor and carrying official documentation from a retired sailor friend, Frederick took a train from Baltimore heading north. When he arrived in Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, he stepped onto free soil for the first time. From there, he took another train north and eventually reached New York. At 20 years of age, he was free, but on his own. After adopting the name Frederick Johnson, he sent a letter to Anna in Baltimore asking her to come to New York. On the 15th of September, 3 days after her arrival, the two were married. Acting on advice, Anna and Frederick quickly left New York for New Bedford, Massachusetts, where they called on Nathan and Mary Johnson. When Nathan Johnson advised the new arrivals to choose a new surname as there were already a dozen fugitive slaves named Johnson, Frederick asked his host what name he should adopt. Having just read Walter Scott's The Lady of the Lake, Johnson suggested the name of the Scottish clan Douglas, to which Frederick added an extra S for distinctiveness. Thus was born the famous name of Frederick Douglass. The Douglasses settled in New Bedford for the next few years. Frederick attempted to find a job as a caulker, but was turned down when the white caulkers threatened to walk out if he was hired. As a result, for the next 3 years, he made a living working small jobs. During this time, Anna gave birth to their daughter Rosetta in June 1839, and a son named Louis in October 1840. Douglass also became a leading figure at the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church during this time, where he preached to a community of fugitive and freed slaves. He began reading The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper published on a weekly basis by William Lloyd Garrison, a prominent promoter of the abolition of slavery in the whole of the United States, and when Garrison visited New Bedford in April 1839, Douglass pledged himself to the abolitionist cause. Thereafter, the cause of abolitionism inspired his sermons in church, and in August 1841, he spoke for the first time to white abolitionists, including Garrison, at a convention in Nantucket, where he moved the audience by vividly describing his experiences as a slave. Following this performance, Douglass traveled throughout New England on the abolitionist speaking circuit. After a 3-month trial period, in early 1842, he was hired by the American Anti-Slavery Society as a full-time lecturer. Over the next few years, as he traveled from town to town across the northern states, he would build a reputation as one of the most powerful speakers for the abolitionist cause. From July to December 1843, Douglass joined several leading abolitionists in the 100 Conventions campaign, aiming to reach between 300,000 and 500,000 people by speaking at 100 meetings across the northern states. Douglass was a strong supporter of Garrison's position that the U.S. Constitution needed to be changed to alter the status of slavery on a federal level. They were opposed by political moderates from New York who founded the Liberty Party, a political party that intended to advance the cause of abolitionism through more gradual means. Douglass was present at the 1843 Colored Convention in Buffalo, New York, where Henry Highland Garnet made an impassioned speech urging resistance to slavery by force. Douglass rejected Garnet's advocacy for insurrection as irresponsible and unrealistic, remaining faithful to the Garrisonian doctrine of non-resistance. But only a few weeks later, Douglass and his fellow speakers were beaten by a mob in Pendleton, Indiana, which damaged his right hand permanently. Following the incident, Douglass began to turn away from non-resistance, and his attachment to Garrison's rigorous orthodoxy started to wane. While Douglass was on his speaking tours, Anna had two more children, Frederick Jr. in March 1842 and Charles in October 1844. Following the latter's birth, Frederick spent more time at home, and between 1844 and May 1845, he wrote his first autobiography, a narrative on the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself. This soon became an international bestseller. At this juncture, fearing that Douglass's newfound fame might endanger him from slave catchers who, theoretically, could detain him and return him to the Olds in Maryland, his abolitionist friends sent him on a 2-year speaking tour of the British Isles. Douglass started his tour in Ireland, where he met with Daniel O'Connell, an Irish land reformer and politician who campaigned against British rule. While Douglass rejected the analogy that British rule in Ireland was the same as slavery in the United States, once he witnessed the degree of poverty that pertained in Ireland, just as the Great Famine was beginning there, he spoke passionately about the plight of starving Irishmen and women. Douglass was received with equal fervor in Scotland. By May 1846, he was in London, about to start a tour of England, where Garrison joined him in August. While there, at the end of 1846, Douglass's friends back in the U.S., Ellen Richardson and her sister-in-law Anna, managed to raise £150 to buy Frederick's freedom from Hugh Auld. Thus, when Douglass arrived back in America in the spring of 1847, he did so as a completely free man without the fear of capture hanging over him. Not long after his return home, Douglass considered launching his own anti-slavery newspaper. On a final tour with Garrison in the summer of 1847, Douglass echoed his mentor's call for northern states to separate from the Union and establish their own fully free republic. Douglass partnered with Pittsburgh journalist Martin Delany to launch a black newspaper. The North Star was published for the first time on the 3rd of December 1847 from Rochester in New York. During the following year, Douglass wrote for the paper every week. In July 1848, he became a prominent member of the women's rights movement by being the only black person to attend the Seneca Falls Convention, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The delegates unanimously supported resolutions demanding equality in labor, law, family, and other areas of life, but the convention was split on women's right to vote. Douglass spoke forcefully in favor of female suffrage and may have helped the resolution pass. Meanwhile, in 1848, Douglass also used his newspaper to advance the cause of the Free Soil Party. This was a party which briefly existed between 1848 and 1854 in the United States. Led by the former president, Martin Van Buren, Its goal was to prevent slavery being extended into the new parts of the United States, which had been won at the end of the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. Douglass was ultimately disappointed when General Zachary Taylor, the slave-owning hero of the recent war in Mexico, but a figure with a very vague political platform, emerged victorious. In May 1849, Douglass's English friend Julia Griffiths moved to Rochester to help Douglass edit and manage the North Star. Under Griffiths' influence, in 1850, the wealthy New York abolitionist Gerrit Smith helped to keep the North Star financially afloat. In 1851, the North Star was merged with Smith's newspaper, the Liberty Party paper, to form what was termed Frederick Douglass's paper. Douglass's association with Smith prompted his former speaking companions to denounce him as an enemy and a traitor, while Douglass sought the moral high ground by declaring his willingness to work with anyone to advance the abolitionist cause. In September 1853, Garrison himself wrote how Douglass had been cursed by selfish ambition and insinuated that Douglass and Griffiths were having an affair. The bitter internecine struggle among the two most prominent leaders of the abolitionist movement died down following an intervention by the author of the acclaimed abolitionist novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who managed to have Douglass and Garrison reach a peace accord with one another. The 1850s were a period of growing tensions between free states in the north of the Union and the slave-owning states of the South, and further to the west towards Texas. The westward expansion of the United States and American victory in the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 had raised questions over whether slavery would be extended westwards beyond Texas to the West Coast, where the California gold rush had led to a huge wave of migration from 1848 onwards. California soon applied for admission to the Union as a state, but on the basis of being a free state. The southern states had resisted this and were determined to avoid California setting such a precedent of banning slavery in states newly admitted into the Union. This, in turn, led to the Compromise of 1850, a congressional move which allowed for California to join the Union as a free state while passing a Fugitive Slave Act that provided for stricter penalties for fugitive slaves and those who aided them. It was a watershed moment for Douglass. After the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, he turned his back on pacifist approaches and instead began advising his audiences where he spoke to protect fugitive slaves and resist attempts to capture them. In his speeches and his journalism, he increasingly justified the killing of slave bounty hunters and slave owners, not only as self-defense, but as a way in which black men could assert their humanity in defending their natural rights. In July 1852, Douglass was invited to give an Independence Day speech before the Rochester Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society, where Griffiths was secretary. He began by praising the Founding Fathers and their ringing words of liberty, only to denounce the hypocrisy of slavery in a republic founded on such ideals. Speaking on behalf of all slaves past and present, Douglass asked his audience why they had invited him, telling them, "This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn." Douglass claimed that the Fugitive Slave Act had transformed the country into a hunting ground for men, before lashing out at the churchmen who knelt in prayer while their hands were dripping with the blood of slaves. Yet, he ended on a hopeful note, expressing faith in the anti-slavery principles of the Constitution and the march of progress. In delivering the famous speech, Douglass placed himself in the tradition of Old Testament prophets, seeking a way out of the new Babylonian captivity for his people. In response to another request from Griffiths and the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, this time to write a short story for a collection, Autographs for Freedom, Douglass wrote his first and only work of fiction. In his 1853 novella, The Heroic Slave, Douglass adapted the tale of Madison Washington, an enslaved cook on the ship Creole, who had led a successful rebellion on board, killing a slaveholder, subduing the crew, and ordering the vessel to sail to Nassau in the Bahamas, where the slaves on board obtained their freedom. By 1855, Douglass had reinvented himself as a political abolitionist, and that summer he produced his second autobiography, Bondage and Freedom, not only updating his narrative of 10 years earlier, but also charting his evolution as a campaigner and thinker. Shortly afterwards, Julia Griffiths left for England, and with fewer writers contributing to his paper and funding issues, the paper was renamed Douglass's Monthly in 1858. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act sought to repeal the Missouri Compromise, an act which had been passed back in 1820 to ban slavery north of a line lying along 36.5 degrees north of the equator, instead arguing that Kansas and Nebraska should be allowed to decide the status of slavery in their jurisdictions themselves. The legislation led to a series of bloody confrontations in Kansas between pro- and anti-slavery settlers. In the midst of this, Douglass proposed sending 1,000 free black families to settle in Kansas, the idea being to tip the settler population on balance in support of abolition in the region. His plan didn't come to fruition, but the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act did lead directly to the establishment of the Republican Party, an important development in the history of slavery in the U.S. This brought together various political groups, such as the Free Soil Party, who wanted to stop the expansion of slavery. Douglass found much to criticize about the Republicans, since they did not propose to abolish slavery where it already existed. However, they were much more opposed to the institution than the Democratic Party, which, in the middle decades of the 19th century, had become the party of the slave-owning Southern states. Thus, in August 1856, Douglass indicated his support for Republican presidential candidate John C. Fremont in the November elections. Fremont received 33% of the popular vote, an impressive feat for a new party, but was unable to prevent the Democratic candidate James Buchanan from becoming president. In the late 1850s, Douglass was involved in the attempted insurrection of the white abolitionist John Brown. Brown and Douglass had known each other since the 1840s, and Brown regularly talked about leading a slave rebellion in Virginia, operating as a guerrilla fighter from the Appalachian Mountains. Now, in early 1858, in the aftermath of the Dred Scott decision handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1857, which effectively declared that African Americans did not have the same constitutional rights as white people, Brown proposed to Douglass that he would attack the federal arsenal located at Harper's Ferry in the state of Virginia and use the weapons acquired there to launch a slave rebellion in the wider region. Douglass considered the scheme unrealistic, but offered financial and organizational assistance. On the night of the 16th of October, Brown's band of 19 men captured the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, but by the 18th, the raid was over and a heavily wounded Brown was taken captive, and executed on the 2nd of December. In the days that followed, Douglass was accused of being one of the organizers of the raid, forcing him to escape to Canada, from where he boarded a ship to England in mid-November. In Britain, he undertook a 6-month speaking tour, in which he hailed John Brown as a martyr. While he was so engaged, an official investigation was carried out back in the US into the raid on Harper's Ferry, one which ultimately exonerated Douglass. While the investigation was still ongoing, Douglass received news that his youngest child, Annie, had died on the 13th of March, prompting him to make arrangements to go back home to his grieving family, arriving back in Rochester in late April 1860. In the months that followed his return to America, Douglass was mainly concerned with the presidential election of 1860, owing to a growing split within the Democratic Party between a Northern group and a Southern faction. It seemed likely that the Republican Party candidate, an Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, would triumph. Once again, Douglass struggled to reconcile his radicalism with the moderation of the Republican Party and its candidate, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was an abolitionist, though one who was more concerned about avoiding a civil war and saving the Union. He won just below 40% of the popular vote in the election and was not even on the ballot in several Southern states. But in a highly divisive election, he still triumphed, after obtaining the highest number of votes in the Electoral College. While the state of South Carolina threatened to secede from the Union, Douglass feared and expected a compromise between pro- and anti-slavery politicians in Washington to save the Union. He was consequently surprised when South Carolina seceded from the Union on the 20th of December over the possibility that Lincoln would abolish slavery across the country. In the months that followed in early 1861, 6 other Southern states followed South Carolina and seceded from the Union to form what was termed the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy. With this, the American Civil War was about to begin. Once the Civil War began on the 12th of April 1861 with the Southern Confederacy's bombardment of the Federal garrison at Fort Sumter, Douglass seized on the prospect of eradicating slavery through armed conflict. He rallied to President Lincoln and the volunteers who fought in the Union Army, and in his writings throughout the period from 1861 to 1865, urged the bold prosecution of the war and the destruction of the South and its slave society. Yet, he was also frustrated at times, particularly with the reluctance of Lincoln and the Union government to use black regiments to fight the war, especially where slaves who had escaped from the South were concerned, while also expressing concern over Lincoln's delays in passing measures to ensure that slavery would be abolished nationwide once the war ended. These came over time, though. In the course of 1862, Lincoln and the Republicans gradually passed abolitionist measures. Congress freed the slaves in the Capital District of Columbia in April of that year and banned slavery in all Western territories in June. In July, Lincoln signed the Second Confiscation Act, which freed slaves in Confederate territory occupied by Union armies, as well as slaves who had escaped to Union lines. Douglass welcomed these efforts, which were increasingly regarded by Northerners as acts of military necessity in order to win the war. On the 17th of September 1862, the Battle of Antietam occurred in Maryland as General McClellan's forces faced the Army of Northern Virginia, led by Robert E. Lee. In the bloodiest day of combat in American history, McClellan forced Lee to retreat, though Lincoln castigated him for failing to pursue and destroy the Confederate army. Following this imperfect victory, Lincoln was confident enough to issue the Emancipation Proclamation on the 22nd of September, which announced to the South that from the 1st of January 1863, all slaves in the states in rebellion from the Union shall be thenceforward and forever free. Douglass seized upon these words with renewed hope and, recognizing Lincoln's instinctive cautiousness before making any commitments, was optimistic that Lincoln would stop at nothing to make the words of the proclamation reality. Lincoln's proclamation opened the door to finally recruit black men into the Union Army. Massachusetts was the first state to recruit black soldiers, and in January 1863, Governor John Andrew began to recruit men into the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. Douglass acted as a recruiting agent for the unit. In March 1863, he published an editorial entitled "Men of Color to Arms" in his monthly newspaper. Then, on the 18th of May, Douglass joined Garrison for the 54th's presentation of colors at Reedville, Massachusetts, following which the regiment left Boston for South Carolina. In its first major action of the war in mid-July, the 54th led a desperate assault on Fort Wagner on the approaches to Charleston Harbor, resulting in the deaths of around 300 men. Yet, even as the men of the 54th fought and died for the Union, the War Department was paying these soldiers $3 less per month than their white comrades. Having learned this, in August 1863, Douglass traveled to Washington and met Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to lobby for equal pay. After receiving an offer to help General Lorenzo Thomas in the Mississippi Valley with the recruitment and organization of black troops, Douglass went to the White House to meet President Lincoln. In a frank conversation, Lincoln defended his gradual approach towards emancipation, citing the need to prepare public opinion. On pay inequality for black soldiers, the president told a disappointed Douglass that it was a necessary concession to the white soldiers, which he made to avoid tensions within the military. Overall, Douglass emerged from the meeting with a sense of respect and admiration for the president, who promised him that slavery would not survive the war. 1863 was undoubtedly a major turning point in the war. The foremost engagement of the entire conflict was fought at the Battle of Gettysburg over a period of 3 days at the beginning of July near Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. In the course of it, General George Meade repulsed Lee's second northern invasion and forced the Confederates to withdraw south. In the west, General Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, gaining control of the Mississippi and splitting the Confederacy in two. In his famous Gettysburg Address from November 1863, President Lincoln envisaged a new birth of freedom at the end of the war. As he returned to the lecture circuit at the end of the year, and with the result of the war looking more and more like a Union victory, Douglass turned his attention towards the next battles, fighting racial discrimination in Northern society and obtaining the right to vote and hold office. Frustrated at Lincoln's unwillingness to commit too quickly to economic and political rights for freed slaves, Douglass supported the third-party candidacy of John C. Fremont in the 1864 presidential election, who ran under the Radical Democracy Party ticket as a fringe challenger to Lincoln. In early September, the Democrats nominated General George McClellan, a mediocre commander, but an extremely popular one among the Union armies. On the 19th of August, Douglass met Lincoln for a second time at the president's invitation. When their conversation was interrupted by a secretary informing Lincoln that the governor of Connecticut was waiting to see him, the president gave instructions to tell the governor to wait, or "I want to have a long talk with my friend Frederick Douglass." Lincoln confided to Douglass his fears of losing the election, and the prospect of a negotiated peace, and asked Douglass to formulate a plan to encourage as many slaves as possible to flee from the South before the election. With this new responsibility upon his shoulders, Douglass formulated a plan for sub-agents appointed by him to operate in urban areas of rebel states to lead squads of slaves into the North, in close cooperation with Union generals. Douglass's ambitious plan to move slaves from the southern states to the free North ultimately proved to be unnecessary. General William T. Sherman captured Atlanta on the 2nd of September 1864, striking at the heart of the Confederacy. The news convinced many Northerners that the war would soon be over, and when Fremont withdrew his candidacy later that month, Douglass rallied to the Republicans again. While Douglass did not campaign officially for Lincoln, as president of a black convention at Syracuse, New York in October 1864, Douglass warned his audience not to miss the chance of crushing slavery and ending racism, urging victory over both the Democratic Party and the Confederacy. Following a bitter campaign in which the Democrats tried to claim Lincoln had African ancestry, the president won re-election with 212 electoral votes to 21, receiving 78% of the popular vote among Union soldiers. A few days later, General Sherman launched a devastating campaign, marching from Atlanta to the port of Savannah, destroying everything in his path. This was the sort of warfare that Douglass had preached in order to build a new free society, and Sherman's campaign caused a significant dent in Confederate morale. On the 3rd of February 1865, the Congress adopted the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, which was ratified by the states in December. Both the war and slavery were nearly at an end. Douglass traveled to Washington, D.C. for Lincoln's second inauguration on the 4th of March, 1865. In a speech reminiscent of Douglass's own rhetoric over the years, Lincoln vowed that every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. A month later, Union armies occupied the Confederate capital of Richmond, and on the 9th of April, Robert E. Lee surrendered at the courthouse in Appomattox. The war was effectively over, though it would still take several weeks to round up the remaining Confederate armies. Days after Lee's surrender, President Lincoln was assassinated on the 14th of April, 1865. Douglass was shocked to hear about the death of the president whom he had come to admire, and later remarked on how the shared grief over Lincoln's demise provided Douglass with a sense of kinship with his fellow Americans. With the end of the American Civil War, Douglass reached a crossroads in his life. A sign of this was seen in May 1865, when he attended the 32nd anniversary meeting of the Anti-Slavery Society. Here, the main topic of debate was whether or not the organization should now disband, given that the war had achieved their ultimate goal, or continue on to achieve further liberties for the African American community. At the meeting, Garrison argued that it would be absurd to maintain an anti-slavery organization when slavery no longer existed, but Douglass urged the society to work towards other initiatives, especially expanding the franchise. In the period that followed, he sided with the radical Republicans in Congress, who fought President Andrew Johnson for control over Reconstruction, the policy which aimed to rebuild the southern states in a way which would heal the Union. Johnson was a Tennessee Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, and his place on Lincoln's presidential ticket was regarded as a show of national unity during the war. But unionism aside, Johnson was a conservative who sought to reintegrate the South back into the Union as soon as possible, and readmitted Southern states into the Union with black codes that continued to restrict the liberties of freed slaves. By early 1866, congressional Republicans sought to seize control of the Reconstruction agenda from the president, passing a bill to strengthen the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal government agency set up the previous year to manage the affairs of the newly freed slaves in the South. After the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1866, which guaranteed citizenship without regard to race, Congress strengthened constitutional protections by adopting the 14th Amendment, a measure which provided a guarantee of citizenship and equal rights to all people in the U.S. Douglass considered it his new vocation to advocate for a radical vision of Reconstruction that protected the 4 million freed slaves. Although he was impressed by the equal rights protections offered by the 14th Amendment, Douglass opposed the amendment as it did not confer the right to vote. Douglass's campaign for black male suffrage inspired campaigners and writers such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton to begin calling for women to have the right to vote as well in America. While Douglass supported female suffrage, at the end of 1866, he argued that black suffrage was a matter of life and death, while for women, it was only desirable. Douglass's position attracted racial insults from the women's rights leaders. After Congress passed the 15th Amendment in February 1869, which gave all black men the vote without any provisions being made for women, Stanton argued that black women were better as slaves, and while Douglass continued to support a further amendment providing for female suffrage, the rift between him and the women's rights movement would never heal completely. During the post-war years, Douglass continued to travel on the lecture circuit in an effort to provide for an increasingly fractured family. His sons struggled to emerge from their illustrious father's shadow, working for unequal pay and struggling to meet their expenses, while his daughter Rosetta was finding it difficult to sustain a growing family with her husband, whose demands for financial assistance from Frederick caused a rift with her brothers. In 1870, Douglass bought the newspaper New National Era, which he edited in Washington along with his sons Lewis and Frederick Jr. He was in the capital when he heard the news that his house in Rochester had burned down in a fire on the 2nd of June, 1872. While his family and most of his library were saved, Douglass estimated that around $5,000 worth of possessions had been lost, a substantial sum at the time. He was in no doubt that it was a racially motivated arson attack. He linked the destruction of his house to the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacist organization linked to the Democratic Party, which sought to undermine Republican Reconstruction by unleashing a campaign of violence and intimidation against former slaves. In his paper, Douglass supported the new President Ulysses S. Grant's efforts to crack down on the Klan with federal troops. After the fire in Rochester, Douglass moved his entire family to Washington, D.C., where he continued to use his newspaper as his mouthpiece in the Reconstruction debate. He resisted the lost cause narrative from ex-Confederates who claimed that they had not been defeated in battle, but by the Union's economic superiority, and that the war had never been about slavery, but their way of life. Douglass was appalled by how the death of Robert E. Lee in 1870 was mourned not only in the South, but across the nation. He denounced the Democratic Party, resurgent on the back of anti-black intimidation, as a party of murder, robbery, treason, dishonesty, and fraud. He was grateful for the Republican Party's role in abolishing slavery and advancing black civil rights, and campaigned for General Grant's election in 1868 and his re-election in 1872. He also supported Grant's initiative to annex Santo Domingo, the modern-day Dominican Republic, as a refuge for freed slaves from the South who were threatened by the Klansmen. After visiting the island in early 1871, alongside a congressional commission, Douglass promoted annexation in the press. The initiative failed to win the support of the necessary two-thirds majority in the Senate due to opposition from radical Republican Senator Charles Sumner, who believed that annexation was admitting defeat in the South. By the middle of the 1870s, the Grant administration had effectively given up on Reconstruction. In 1873, the country suffered a deep economic depression as the railroad boom ended, causing a crash in the stock market and commodity prices, widespread unemployment, and the failure of thousands of businesses. The financial panic spread to the Freedmen's Bank, an institution created in 1865 where freedmen and their families could deposit their savings and take out loans. As the bank faced bankruptcy in 1874, in March, Douglass was asked by the board to become its new president to restore confidence in the institution. Despite loaning $10,000 to the bank out of his own pocket, Douglass was unable to prevent its collapse at the end of June. While Douglass's loans were repaid in full, most depositors eventually received 60 cents to the dollar. When he was criticized for his lack of financial experience, Douglass blamed corruption among its governors and lamented that Congress was no longer willing to help keep the bank afloat. In October that same year, he closed down his newspaper following a decline in subscribers, estimating that he had lost $10,000 in the whole venture. Douglass's personal fortunes waned alongside that of the Republican Party in the aftermath of the financial crisis of the mid-1870s. The Democrats overturned a Republican majority of 110 and won a majority of 60 in the midterm elections of 1874. A furious Douglass denounced the retreat from Reconstruction in a series of speeches in New Hampshire in early 1875, reminding his audiences that Union soldiers had not won the war in order to lose the peace. In a 4th of July speech that year, he asked, "If war among whites brought peace and liberty to black people, what will peace among the whites bring?" Controversially, Douglass criticized the black community for being dependent on white men for their freedom. When jubilant Democrats claimed that Douglass was calling on black people to desert the Republican Party, Douglass denied doing so, recognizing the Republicans as by far the friendlier party for the African American community. In June 1876, he attended the Republican National Convention in Cincinnati. There, Rutherford B. Hayes was nominated as the party's presidential candidate. Following this, in one of the closest and most controversial elections in United States history, Hayes won the election by a single electoral college vote. In an effort to pacify Southern Democrats with his opponent, Samuel Tilden, clearly having won the popular vote, and who threatened to go to war over the disputed election, Hayes agreed to remove federal troops from the South, a move which effectively brought efforts at Reconstruction to an end. Segregation and the Jim Crow laws would follow in the former Confederate states. When Hayes took office in March 1877, he appointed Douglass as Marshal of the District of Columbia, a law enforcement role in the federal capital. The appointment was not only a symbolic step for the cause of African Americans, but gave Douglass a lucrative salary to support his family. It also allowed him to use his influence to secure government jobs for his sons. In June, he decided to return to Maryland for a poignant meeting with the aging Thomas Auld, during which the former master and slave settled their differences. During another visit to the Eastern Shore a year and a half later, he went to the farm where he had been born and located the old cedar tree beside his grandmother's long-lost cabin, from where he scooped up a couple of handfuls of soil to take home with him to Washington. Although Douglass himself had attained celebrity status and served the Hayes administration, the Democrats gained control of both houses of Congress in 1878, and the president had given up on federal protection for freedmen. In response, many black people decided to leave the South for Kansas, where they could count on Republican congressional representatives and a degree of federal protection. Douglass was almost alone among prominent black leaders opposing the Kansas exodus, arguing that it served as a concession to white racism and an admission of Confederate victory. He urged the freedmen to stay and fight for their rights at the ballot box in spite of the intimidation they faced. Though his critics labeled him out of touch with the reality on the ground, Douglass was unwilling to abandon all he had fought for during the past 2 decades. In 1878, Douglass and his family moved to Cedar Hill in Anacostia in Washington, D.C. Here, he entertained an increasing number of grandchildren. In the 1880 elections, Douglass campaigned for the Republican candidate, James Garfield. Later, Douglass recalled with pride marching next to the outgoing and incoming presidents as marshal during Garfield's inauguration in March 1881, but was disappointed when Garfield demoted him to the office of Recorder of Deeds for the District of Columbia. A few weeks after meeting Douglass, Garfield was mortally wounded by an assassin's bullet on the 2nd of July, dying an agonizing 79 days later. That summer, Douglass published yet another autobiography. The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass was his third and final effort at relating his life story. When he visited the Y plantation again in June 1881, Douglass was given a tour by the Lloyd family. The former slave was now the guest of honor. Having mourned the deaths of 4 grandchildren from various childhood diseases in August 1882, Douglass also faced the loss of his wife, Anna, the woman who had built and managed a stable domestic life for the itinerant Douglass for more than 40 years. Her death was a heavy blow to Frederick, who spent a month in Maine in the summer of 1883 after suffering a period of intense emotional stress following Anna's passing. In January 1884, he decided to fill the void in his life by secretly marrying Helen Pitts, a 46-year-old white woman's rights activist, whom Douglass employed in the recorder's office. Both bride and groom did not inform their families beforehand, but while Pitt's relatives condemned her for marrying a black man when they found out, Douglass's children resented him for marrying a woman who was not much older than them. In response to a hostile black press, Douglass reminded them that he himself was mixed race. By 1884, Douglass adopted a more pessimistic tone about the South, where freedmen continued to toil the fields of their old masters for wages so low that they could not leave. In the 18 years since its ratification, the 14th Amendment had been weakened by a series of Supreme Court rulings. In U.S. v. Cruikshank in 1873, the court ruled that the equal rights protections could only be enforced by the states rather than the federal government, and in an October 1883 ruling, the court decided that the protections in the 14th Amendment applied only to states rather than acts of discrimination by individuals or businesses. Douglass railed against the fact that the states' rights doctrine remained so embedded in the American political system that one of the landmark accomplishments of the Reconstruction era was rendered effectively meaningless. In the November presidential election, Grover Cleveland of New York became the first Democrat to win the White House since the American Civil War. Douglass was criticized for hanging on to the position of recorder as Cleveland entered office, but he justified this on the basis of his desire to further Cleveland's anti-corruption agenda. After Douglass was replaced as recorder in March 1886, he and Helen made plans for a trip to Europe. In a departure from the punishing speaking schedules of the past, Douglass intended to see the sights and visit old friends. After arriving in Liverpool in September, Douglass reconnected with the Richardson sisters who had bought his freedom 40 years earlier. After 2.5 months in Paris, the Douglasses traveled south to the Mediterranean and on to Italy, Egypt, and Greece, marveling at wonders such as the ruins of the Roman Empire, the Great Pyramids at Giza outside Cairo, and the Acropolis of ancient Athens. On their way back west, they stopped in Italy and England again, before a brief sojourn in Ireland, where Douglass indicated his support for the Anglo-Irish politician Charles Stewart Parnell's campaign for Home Rule in Ireland, whereby a devolved Irish Parliament would be established in Dublin. Back in America, Douglass spoke to audiences of his great delight in visiting Egypt, the setting for the biblical tale of Joseph, the son of Jacob, who was sold into slavery by his brothers before using his ability to interpret dreams to become the Pharaoh's chief advisor. Douglass reinvented Joseph's story to reflect his own experience of rising from slavery to lead his people to freedom. In March 1888, after a speaking tour in South Carolina and Georgia, Douglass returned to Washington, disillusioned by what he had seen in the South. At the Republican National Convention in June, he once again sought to remind his audience about the meaning of the Civil War. After Republican Benjamin Harrison was elected to the presidency, Douglass was appointed U.S. Minister to Haiti in the summer of 1889. For the next 2 years, Douglass had to handle the delicate matter of the United States seeking a naval coaling station at the port of Mont-Saint-Nicolas, while the Haitians were afraid of the implications for their sovereignty. Douglass arrived in Haiti in October, just as General Fleury Hippolyte had become president following a coup supported by American arms. In late 1890, Harrison appointed Admiral Bancroft Gherardi as special commissioner to negotiate a lease for the mole. After Gherardi's arrival in January, he claimed that Hippolyte had made a promise to the American government to give up the mole in return for support in his coup, a claim that was vigorously denied. By April, the admiral had ordered 7 warships to the harbor of Port-au-Prince to intimidate the Haitians, a move which prompted the Haitian government to refuse the lease. Douglass criticized American policy and sympathized with the Haitians, and at the end of June, he returned to the United States and resigned his post. After his return to the United States, Douglass set about defending his conduct in the negotiations for the mole, arguing that Gherardi's heavy-handed approach had scuttled a potential deal. Meanwhile, he gained sufficient credit among the Haitians that he was invited by President Hippolyte to represent Haiti at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. Douglass spent most of 1892 preparing for the Haitian pavilion and the exhibits within. When the pavilion was completed and the fair opened in January 1893, Douglass delivered speeches thanking President Hippolyte and glorifying Toussaint Louverture's slave rebellion, which had led to Haiti becoming the first free nation of color in the Americas, all the way back in the 1790s. In 1894, Douglass, who by then was well into his 70s, commenced one final speaking tour, as news of lynchings in the South became an almost daily occurrence. Despite these developments, Douglass still ended his speeches on an optimistic tone, urging his audiences to take action and overcome their prejudices. But the 76-year-old's exhortations were given more in hope than in expectation. By the mid-1890s, Douglass was in increasingly poor health. On the 20th of February 1895, he died from a heart attack just days after his 77th birthday, or at least the date that the former slave had chosen to represent his birth date. Frederick Douglass lived an extraordinary life, rising from slavery to become the most photographed and famous African American of the late 19th century. From his earliest days in Maryland, he fought against a great many obstacles, but having learned to read and write and having educated himself, he fled from slavery in the South and achieved freedom in the North. There, he became something of a sensation on the abolitionist speaking circuit in the 1840s, also making an impression during his visit to Britain and Ireland. After starting out as a young radical orator on a moral and religious crusade, he later embraced American political institutions as the most effective vehicle for the abolitionist cause, making enemies out of former friends in the process. For almost 40 years, he was what we might call a functional Republican, one who realized the limitations of white reform, but worked alongside individuals like Abraham Lincoln to drive American progress forward. During the Civil War, Douglass tied the cause of the Union to the cause of abolition in his journalism and his speeches, and in doing so, galvanized support for the Union and its cause. Admittedly, in his final years, he was disappointed by the sense that the Union had won the war but lost the peace. But this only led him to rediscover his old radical voice and urge his audiences to continue fighting for equality and freedom. In doing so, he inspired the subsequent generations of African American leaders and reformers, such as Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Martin Luther King. What do you think of Frederick Douglass? Was he an effective champion of the cause of abolition and equal rights? Or was he too divisive and opinionated to keep the black community united? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.